10 years ago, the Boston Bruins pulled off the unthinkable at the NHL Draft, and not the good kind of unthinkable. They set up a historic situation where they had 3 straight picks in the first round, but instead of propelling them into hockey's next dynasty, what they did was pulled off hockey's biggest joke. These three guys, really these 4, including Don Sweeney, are what will be remembered. This is a lasting image in Bruins history for all the wrong reasons. It's time we revisit the 2015 NHL Draft and show not only how bad it was for the Bruins at the time, but how it became the worst draft mistake in the history of the league and why the Bruins are still paying for it 10 years later. This 2015 NHL Draft was the origin story for a tenure that Bruins fans are already wanting to forget. This was the Wayne family getting robbed and shot outside the theater while Bruce Wayne watched by. Just watched it happen. Our Batman is Don Sweeney. Peter Chiarelli was hired by Boston back in 2006. We got to take a step back to take a step forward because I'm so fascinated by the Chiarelli era. Okay, he comes into the Bruins in 2006, which was not a great time for the franchise, and they finally did something new. They went outside the organization. They went outside the family to get him from Ottawa. And it was like basically the first time in their history they'd ever done that. And it worked. Okay, he built the Stanley Cup team. He went out and got Savard. He got Zdeno Chara. He built around some of the young players they already had, like Krejci and Bergeron, and, well, not Andrew Raycroft, but he flipped him for Tuukka Rask. And all of a sudden, he's building a contender. They win the Stanley Cup for the first time in 39 years in 2011, and he's overseeing one of the great eras in Boston Bruins history. That said, by the end of his tenure in the mid-2010s, we're starting to kind of see the signs of Chiarelli's unraveling that really showed themselves at his next stop in Edmonton. The multi-year contracts, the bevy of no-trade clauses for these bottom 6 players. Does it sound familiar? I'll bet it does. So after missing the playoffs for the first time in 8 years, Chiarelli was fired in 2015, and the Bruins, ever afraid to go outside the family, don't want to make that mistake again. They hire his assistant, and suddenly, Bruins legend's a strong word, Don Sweeney is now the GM of the Bruins. Even though it had just worked for them to go outside the family, they thought, nope, we're not doing that again. Cam Neely's picking his buddy that he would go down the corners with, and now he's the GM. So the Bruins get the 14th pick in the draft, as you do for just missing the playoffs, and kind of instantly, Don Sweeney starts moving and shaking. Okay? He trades a Bruins fan favorite, Milan Lucic, to LA for their first-round pick, which is 13th overall. Now, all of a sudden, the Bruins got back-to-back picks. And then he does something even more bold. He trades the future of their defense core, Dougie Hamilton, who looks like a terrific puck-moving defenseman, one heck of a big, two-way franchise kind of defenseman, while he's an RFA, trades him to Calgary and gets the number 15 pick in return. So now it has all fallen into place. The Bruins have 3 straight picks in the first round to rebuild their Stanley Cup window on the fly. There's only 2 problems with that. The first problem is this. The Bruins missed the playoffs that year with 96 points. They're one of the few teams in the history of the league who have ever gotten 95 points and did not make the postseason. They were not a bad team. They didn't need 3 first-round picks to rebuild instead of just keeping Dougie Hamilton and having him be a part of the future. Now, the hindsight's 2020. It's not like Dougie Hamilton's had this dazzling career. But if he's playing alongside the guys he would have played alongside in Boston, maybe it does turn out to be a little bit better. The second problem is this. Don Sweeney can't evaluate talent. Don Sweeney can't build a roster. We know that now. We just didn't know that yet. But the good news for Bruins fans is this. This draft was loaded. McDavid, Eichel, Marner, Werenski, Rantanen, all taken in the top 10 before the Bruins had a chance to pick each of their first 3 picks. So we already know this is loaded with talent. Some of it's off the board, still quite a bit of NHL talent still left on the board. And then it happened. Instead of going with the number 13 prospect in Bob McKenzie's mock draft, which is usually the most accurate. So instead of going with the number 13 prospect in Bob McKenzie's draft, Kyle Connor, and his 582 points in the NHL 10 years later, they went with defenseman Jakub Zboril. Now, what's interesting about this is of the 3 picks, this was the most on the board the Bruins picked with. McKenzie had Kyle Connor going 13, which is the selection here, but he actually had Zboril going 14, the original Bruins pick. So this was kind of there. It wasn't crazy. But I would say if they wanted the strong puck-moving defenseman they were clearly looking for with that pick, they could have drafted Thomas Chabot, who was still on the board. You've heard of him. You haven't heard of Jakub Zboril outside of this context. Because Zboril only ends up playing 16 career NHL games with 1 goal. A top 15 pick who barely played 15 games in the league. Yeah, he's playing in the Czech Republic now. Can you believe that? Jakub Zboril, first major miss, never made an impact with the big team. In fact, didn't even play a game for the Bruins before Zdeno Chara left 5 years after his draft. So if this was going to be the future of your D-core, you missed. Chara continued to play on your team for 5 more years. Dougie Hamilton is still playing in the league. Thomas Chabot is in his prime, still playing in the league. Jakub Zboril is playing in the Czech Republic. Swing and a miss on lucky pick number 13. At number 14, this is where the Don Sweeney-ness starts. Because at number 14, the Bruins do go well off the board at this point, and they pick Jake DeBrusk. Now, obviously, this one looks okay, right? We know Jake DeBrusk, but you got to stick with me here. He's projected to go 28th by Bob McKenzie. So again, that's a considerable margin. He was supposed to be taking 14 picks after he did. And with a talent-laden draft like this, that's a huge mistake. So this was the first instance not only of Don Sweeney going off the board, but going off the board specifically for a guy with perceived physicality, a guy who could be perceived as a future power forward rather than going with the guys who have the guaranteed skill, the guaranteed talent, for whatever that guarantee is, pick number 14. Okay, Jake DeBrusk's dad, obviously major league tough guy in the NHL. And look, Jake was a good player for the Bruins, right? He hit the 25 goal mark 3 times in his career with the team and was a consistent forward for them on some good teams. Played decently in the playoffs, could play on your second power play unit. But in that draft, at number 14, that's a big miss. That's a big miss. And you look at what he could have done for this team in the future had he been alongside maybe someone like a Kyle Connor instead, and things start to look way, way different. So Jake DeBrusk, good NHL player. Don't get me wrong. Could he be frustrating at times with the Bruins? Sure, he could. And he's probably deserving of being a first-round pick. And in a redraft, he's probably somewhere between 15 and 20. But that is how loaded this first round was. And somehow it's going to get worse. Because pick number 15 is where it goes completely 100% off the rails for the Boston Bruins and solidifies it as the worst first round any team has ever had at the NHL Draft. With pick number 15, the Bruins select Zach Senyshyn. And the air comes out of the place in Florida. Who? Zach Senyshyn? Projected to go somewhere between 40 and 55? And he's picked 15th. A mid-second round pick going 15th overall. You traded Dougie Hamilton when you didn't even need to. He was an RFA. You traded Dougie Hamilton as an RFA so you could get Zach Senyshyn in the draft. This was way, way off the board. Like, this was the 15th overall pick equivalent to Beckett Seneca. Nobody saw this coming. And Senyshyn's career shows exactly why it was way off the board. He comes from the OHL for the Sioux Greyhounds off like a 40-something point season. It's not like he was lighting up the OHL. He really wasn't. He had some upside, but a lot of work to do. That's why he was projected to go in the 40s, not 15th. Like Zaboral, Zach Senyshyn only played 16 games in his NHL career. Recorded 3 points, scored 1 NHL goal on an empty net, which is more than you or I will ever score in the NHL, but he never scored a National Hockey League goal with a goalie in the frame, with somebody trying to stop it. And that's what you got out of Zach Senyshyn. 2 of these players are completely out of the NHL 10 years later. And the one who is still active, Jake DeBrusk, set a career high in goals this year. The only problem is he did it with the Vancouver Canucks, while the Bruins were out here sitting at 28th in the league in goals scored and finishing in 15th place in the Eastern Conference. One of those guys worked out, and he was doing it for another team. What happens when you go off the board, though, in a loaded draft? You miss out. And Don Sweeney and the Boston Bruins missed out. After the Bruins' 3 straight picks, the other NHL teams just thanked Don Sweeney for his stupidity, and they went on and picked Mathew Barzal, Kyle Connor, Thomas Chabot, Joel Eriksson-Ek, and Travis Konechny, all in the first round. After 3 straight picks, the Islanders are thinking, oh my God, Barzal is still there. And they pick him. And that's just in the first round. Because in the second round, roughly 10 or 12 spots before Zach Senyshyn was slated to go, the Hurricanes picked Sebastian Aho. To make it even worse, the Bruins drafted Brandon Carlo in the second round. Now, that's not the part that makes it worse. Brandon Carlo was a solid pick for them, right? But to make it even worse, in that second round, the Bruins drafted defenseman Jeremy Lauzon. 1 pick before the Flames, whose second round pick the Bruins just used to pick Jeremy Lauzon from the Dougie Hamilton trade. The Flames, 1 pick later, picked Rasmus Andersson. Who would you rather have on your blue line? Jeremy Lauzon or Rasmus Andersson? You can't write this shit, man. And now, 10 years later, the Bruins are still suffering because of this. Their core aged out, and they had nowhere to go because Don Sweeney's drafts continued to suck. And all the while, the Bees have had one of the worst prospects pool in the NHL for the last decade. And while that's happening, the Winnipeg Jets have built a legit Stanley Cup contender around Kyle Connor. The Hurricanes have done the same around Sebastian Aho. And you've been passed in your own division by Ottawa, whose blue line is built around Thomas Chabot. All guys you could have had. All of them. And we think over the years, think of all those Bruins teams that needed a little bit more secondary scoring to get them over the top. Every year, that's what they were looking for. And they supposedly had one the whole time in Jake DeBrusk, a guy they picked again over Kyle Connor. And so because of that, they had to trade even more draft capital to get guys like Rick Nash and Tyler Bertuzzi, first-round picks out the door. Do you think they would have been better off with Jake DeBrusk scoring goals or Mathew Barzal scoring goals? Do you think Sebastian Aho might have been a good understudy for Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci? It's something to think about. The Bruins are still paying for this. And now, just a few months ago, we've got Cam Neely making up an excuse a decade later for Don about how Sweeney had just gotten the job. What do you expect? He just got the job. He was promoted. He was the assistant general manager. This draft sunk the Bruins ship. You didn't see it right away because they were still good. They still had that core that was either drafted or locked down or signed and locked down by Peter Chiarelli, not by Don Sweeney. The guy can't evaluate talent, has not been able to. And Peter Chiarelli actually left them quite a gift the year before he was fired. He picked David Pastrnak, 25th overall. But then when that core ages out, that Bergeron, that Krejci, that Chara, that Tuukka, that Marchand, you're left with what Don Sweeney got you. And that's Johnny Beecher, Jeremy Swayman, and the Fabian Lysell, Georgi Merkulov. That's what this gets you. It all started on that June night in 2015. This sunk the Bruins ship, and they won't even admit it. They won't even admit that they fucked it up. What is kind of funny, though, looking at how loaded that top 10 was, I mentioned the guys earlier, right? McDavid, Eichel, Marner, Rantanen, Werenski. And through it all, the Bruins actually did get one of the top 10 picks from that draft. Crazily enough, there's a guy on their roster right now who was a top 10 pick in that year's draft. Nope, it's not one of the other guys like Timo Meier. It's not Ivan Provorov. It's not Noah Hannafin. It's the number 6 pick, Pavel Zacha. Pavel Zacha is the only one. Literally, you look at all the rest of the top 10 and all of them but save the defenseman have more career points than Pavel Zacha. Actually, yeah, all of them. McDavid, Eichel, Dylan Strome, who's finally breaking out, Mitch Marner, Hannafin, Provorov, Werenski, Meier, Rantanen, and right in the middle there is Pavel Zacha. Nice player, but come on. That's where it all started. This image right here. It was one of the first that Don Sweeney even took as the GM of the Boston Bruins, and that is going to be the one that we remember forever. That's the downfall right there. I know it's 10 years later. A lot has happened. But in some other drafts, this might be even more excusable. Some other drafts, but not this one. Not when Barzal and Chabot and Kyle Connor and Sebastian Aho, not when all those guys are still on the board. Travis Konechny, think of how much different these Bruins teams would have been with some of those guys instead. But nope, that's not what we got. We got Jakub Zboril, Zach Senyshyn, oh, God. And even Jake DeBrusk, who gets caught in the shrapnel of this. He's a decent NHL player. He probably, and if that guy was picked 28th, you'd feel pretty good about that. Pretty good about his career. He wasn't, though. He's picked 14th in a loaded draft when there were so many guys still on the board. It's crazy. There's going to be like 5 Hall of Famers in this first round. McDavid's going to go to the Hall of Fame. Eichel's going to go to the Hall of Fame. Marner's going to go to the Hall of Fame. Rantanen's going to go to the Hall of Fame, probably. Kyle Connor will put up a career like that, starting to put up a career like that. Zach Werenski is starting to put up a career like that. Brock Besser, by the way, was also taken in that first round, 23rd. Brock Besser, a guy who I wanted them to go and get this year. You're just always, every time we look at something bad happening with the Bruins and looking at their prospect pool and looking at the future, it all comes back. It all comes back to this night in Florida, which is some sort of ironic because of where that franchise was 10 years ago and how they've completely surpassed you and have rubbed your face in it the last couple of years. That's where that draft was, 2015. That has really severely damaged the Bruins franchise for a decade and will continue for a couple more years at least until someone can fix this prospect pool. And I say someone because it's Don Sweeney or somebody else. To me, it's the worst draft any team has had in NHL history. But let me know what you think. in the comment section below. Am I overblowing this, or is this really that bad a draft? Let me know in the comment section below. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. We're coming at you live on YouTube every weekday, high noon Eastern time, and then we're available wherever you get your podcasts as well. So check out the other videos on the channel, talking everything going on with the Bruins, Red Sox, everything else in the world of Boston sports. So you don't have to go to EEI. You don't have to go to the Sports Hub. Your alternative is right here. And we're actually talking Boston sports every single weekday. I'm your host, Cam Stewart. Zach Burke keeps us on the air 5 days a week.